Is that you, my Putin? I love you so much. I love the way you smell. I love the way your name comes off my lips. Boom.
This is the meanest crowd in the world. I just remember looking out and seeing like everybody, booing, everybody. Even old people, I was like, who boos a child pursuing his dreams?
6 comedians got permanently banned from the Apollo Theater.
But when you at the Apollo, if you don't bring it within the first 30 seconds, your ass in the hook.
One made jokes that were too controversial for television.
And a jury freed him, and that's all I know, a jury freed him. And when the verdict came, when white people was crying all over America, I didn't help, because I walked around, I did them. I was just hollering in the streets, God bless America.
Another destroyed his father's legacy with a Trump impression.
Man, I'm nervous. I can literally hear my dad up in heaven right now, like, boy, you better not mess this up. A lot of crazy stuff going on right now. Donald Trump is president.
A third tried experimental material that nearly killed his career.
Think of all the things that we can do. Maybe we could try out something.
These are the stories of comedians who crossed the lines and were blacklisted forever from the Apollo show. First up is Paul Mooney. Paul Mooney was comedy's most fearless truth teller. The man who wrote for Richard Pryor discovered Robin Williams and created some of the most subversive characters on Chappelle's show. But in 2006, his willingness to speak truth to power finally crossed a line that even the Apollo couldn't tolerate. The Bush administration was deeply unpopular in Harlem by 2006. Hurricane Katrina had exposed federal incompetence. The Iraq War was spiraling into chaos, and Black America was watching their sons and daughters die for a conflict many considered unjust. Into this charged atmosphere walked Paul Mooney, armed with material that would end his relationship with the Apollo forever.
And a jury freed him, and that's all I know, a jury freed him. And when the verdict came, when white people was crying all over America, I didn't help, because I walked around, I did them. I was just hollering in the streets, God bless America.
Mooney had built his career on exposing uncomfortable truths about American racism. He was the comedian who turned mirrors into weapons, forcing audiences to confront their own prejudices. But during his 2006 Apollo performance, he aimed his sharpest arrows directly at the President of the United States and his family. The moment that ended, everything came when Mooney launched into a tirade about the Bush administration. The audience erupted in laughter and applause, but backstage, producers were panicking. Television executives made the decision that would change everything.
Sound like a to me. Good night, thank you very much. You've been nice to me. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Thank you.
Television executives pulled Mooney's segment from the broadcast. His performance was deemed too inflammatory for national television, even for a show that prided itself on pushing boundaries. The comedian who had spent decades making audiences uncomfortable with truth was finally deemed too dangerous for the airwaves. The ban wasn't just about one performance. It was about corporate fear of political backlash. Networks weren't willing to risk their advertising relationships for one comedian's political commentary, no matter how talented. Mooney vowed to never again work at the historic Harlem Theater, but the damage was already done. The exile from the Apollo represented a broader shift in comedy censorship. The same industry that had celebrated Richard Pryor's political rage was now too risk-averse to handle unfiltered black political commentary. For Mooney, the ban was a badge of honor, proof that he had never compromised his voice for easy acceptance. But what happened to Paul Mooney was just the beginning. His banishment opened the floodgates to a series of Apollo disasters that would span decades, each one revealing different aspects of comedy's most unforgiving stage. The next story takes us back to where it all began, with a teenage comedian who thought he could conquer the Apollo's amateur night. Before Paul Mooney was banned for speaking too much truth, another future comedy legend learned the Apollo's brutal lessons the hard way. Dave Chappelle was just another cocky teenager from Washington, D.C., who thought he could conquer the Apollo's notorious amateur night. What happened next would become the most famous bombing in comedy history. The amateur night crowd at the Apollo was legendary for its brutality. For decades, this stage had been where dreams died violent deaths in front of live audiences who showed no mercy to performers who couldn't deliver. Young comedians across the country knew the stories, but they all believed they would be different.
I said, I'm gonna go to that Apollo and rip that mug. I went for the regular Wednesday amateur night. When I say I got booed off stage, I still remember that boo.
Chappelle was 14 years old when he stepped onto that stage, full of confidence and prepared for his big moment. He had been performing in DC clubs and felt ready to prove himself on comedy's biggest stage. But the Apollo audience wasn't interested in giving a young comedian from the suburbs any slack. The booing started almost immediately. Chappelle's material, which had worked in smaller venues, couldn't penetrate the wall of hostility from an audience that demanded authenticity and excellence. Within minutes, the infamous Sandman appeared with his hook, ready to drag the young comedian off stage.
I just remember looking out and seeing like everybody booing, everybody. Even old people, I was like, who boos a child pursuing his dreams?
The humiliation was complete and public. Friends and family watched as Chappelle was rejected by the most important audience in black comedy. But instead of destroying his confidence, this Apollo disaster became his greatest teacher. He learned that comedy wasn't about being liked. It was about being fearless enough to tell the truth.
That was the best thing that ever happened to me. Wow. Best thing, because it was like, hey, they're all booing. My friends are here watching, my mom. This is not that bad. After that, I was fearless.
Rather than running from the stage that had humiliated him, Chappelle used the rejection as fuel. He understood that he needed to prove himself elsewhere before returning to that stage. His Apollo bombing became part of comedy folklore, proof that even future superstars had to earn their stripes through public failure. The temporary ban from amateur night taught Chappelle lessons that would define his entire career. When he finally returned to the Apollo years later as an established comedian, he was transformed. The scared teenager had been replaced by someone who had learned to channel rejection into artistic fuel. But Chappelle's story was just one chapter in the Apollo's long history of crushing young dreams. Years later, another comedian would step onto that same stage, carrying not just his own ambitions, but the weight of comedy's greatest legacy. Where Dave Chappelle had only his own reputation to lose, Mason Pryor carried something far heavier onto the Apollo stage: the weight of being Richard Pryor's son. In 2018, he discovered that legendary bloodlines mean nothing when your material falls flat in front of the most unforgiving crowd in comedy. Mason had grown up in the shadow of arguably the greatest comedian who ever lived. Richard Pryor had conquered the Apollo multiple times, turning his raw honesty about addiction, race, and American hypocrisy into comedic genius. The pressure to live up to that legacy was overwhelming, but Mason felt ready to claim his inheritance.
Man, I'm nervous. I can literally hear my dad up in heaven right now like, boy, you better not mess this up. A lot of crazy stuff going on right now. Donald Trump is president.
The nervous energy was palpable from the moment Mason stepped on stage. Unlike his father, who had channeled anxiety into explosive honesty, Mason seemed overwhelmed by the moment. The Trump material he chose revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of his audience and the Apollo's tradition of fearless truth-telling. The joke structure showed promise, connecting historical perspective to contemporary politics. But Mason's delivery lacked the volcanic intensity that made his father's political commentary so explosive. Where Richard Pryor would have found the emotional core of America's racial trauma, Mason offered observational comedy that felt safe and sanitized.
400 years of slavery and not one of them presidents made the cut. And the worst part is, I feel like I understand really what's the problem with Donald Trump. Everybody here in America knows the code.
The setup had potential, but the execution fell flat. The Apollo audience had come expecting to see Richard Pryor's comedic DNA expressed through his son's voice. Instead, they witnessed a performer who seemed to have inherited the name without the genius that made it legendary. Then came the moment that destroyed everything. Mason launched into a Trump-Putin impression that felt juvenile compared to the sophisticated political satire the Apollo audience expected from a Pryor. The crowd's energy shifted from polite attention to open hostility.
Is that you, my Putin? I love you so much. I love the way you smell. I love the way your name comes off my lips. Boom!
The booing that erupted wasn't just about bad jokes. It was about betrayed expectations. The Apollo audience felt they had been promised gold and given fool's gold instead. The rejection was swift and merciless. Another comedian learning that the Apollo stage demanded authenticity above all else. Mason's response showed maturity, but the damage was done. He understood that he needed to develop his own comedic voice before attempting another Apollo appearance. The theater's rejection taught him that legacy opens doors, but only authentic talent keeps them open. But Mason's failure was different from Chappelle's early bombing. Where Chappelle was an unknown teenager learning the craft, Mason carried expectations that proved impossible to meet. His story connected to an older generation of comedians who had faced the Apollo's judgment in different times, when the stakes were different, but the consequences just as real. Long before Mason Pryor discovered the burden of legacy, Tracy Morgan was learning that spectacular failure could become the foundation for spectacular success. His relationship with the Apollo Theater was defined by one of the most devastating bombings in amateur night history, followed by one of its greatest redemption stories. The 1984 amateur night disaster was particularly brutal because Morgan had built his entire identity around being funny. Growing up in the Bronx, comedy was his survival mechanism, the way he navigated poverty, family dysfunction, and street violence. When the Apollo audience rejected him, it felt like they were rejecting his very essence. The material that bombed in 1984 revealed Morgan's inexperience with the Apollo's unique energy. He had developed his comedy in smaller venues, where his manic energy and unpredictable style could carry weaker material. But the Apollo demanded more than energy. It required substance, timing, and an almost telepathic connection with the audience.
Before I was famous.
I can't imagine.
You ain't never gonna see it. When I walk a room, believe me, that's gonna be some of the funniest you ever seen. If I go down in flames, I'm going down in flames. I'm talking Mayday, 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 Mayday.
Morgan's response to the failure showed the resilience that would define his career. Instead of retreating from performing, he used the humiliation as motivation to improve his craft. He studied successful Apollo performers, refined his material, and learned to read audiences with surgical precision. 9 years later, Morgan returned to the Apollo stage as a completely different performer. His material was sharper, his timing was impeccable, and he had learned to channel his manic energy into focused comedic attacks. The transformation was remarkable.
Nah, I'm just playing, man. I got some stuff on my mind. I'm just bugging. You know what bugged me out? White people. White people. Oh, look at this one right here, looking like the guy from David Koresh.
The 1993 performance was a masterclass in Apollo audience management. Morgan understood that the crowd wanted authenticity mixed with accessibility. His material about racial differences was edgy enough to feel dangerous, but structured enough to generate sustained laughter rather than uncomfortable silence. The confident exit from the stage was everything his 1984 bombing wasn't. Morgan had learned to command the room, to leave audiences wanting more rather than wanting him gone. His Apollo redemption arc became part of his professional mythology, proof that persistence could overcome even the most devastating professional setbacks. Morgan's journey from Apollo reject to Apollo favorite illustrated the theater's role as comedy's ultimate training ground. Performers who could survive the Apollo's brutality emerged stronger, more focused, and better equipped to handle any audience. But Morgan's story was from an earlier era, before the internet changed everything about public failure. Tracy Morgan's Apollo redemption belonged to an era when bombing on stage was a private humiliation shared only with the live audience. By 2001, when Roy Wood Jr. faced his Apollo nightmare, the stakes had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about failing in front of a hostile crowd. It was about failing in front of millions of television viewers who would replay your humiliation forever. Wood Jr. was 3 years into his comedy career when he stepped onto the Apollo stage, confident that his observational style and Southern charm would translate to the legendary Harlem audience. He had been performing successfully in smaller markets and felt ready for the big stage. The Apollo in 2001 was both the same legendary venue and something entirely different. A nationally televised institution where careers could be made or destroyed in real time.
I did the Apollo Theater. I was 3 years into comedy, so I was very new. Very new. It was 2001, and just, it's the Apollo. I walked out, hey, I have a joke. The beauty of getting booed at the Apollo is that you can't tell on television. The audience is very close to the stage.
The intimacy of the Apollo Theater was both blessing and curse for comedians. The close proximity to the audience created an electric energy when things went well, but it also meant that every reaction was visible, every face of disapproval impossible to ignore. Wood Jr. could see the exact moment when the audience turned against him. His material about weathermen and racial representation seemed safe enough for television, but it failed to connect with an audience that expected more edge and authenticity from Apollo performers. The premise had potential, but the execution lacked the conviction that Apollo audiences demanded.
Basically, the weatherman talks too white, and I need a black weatherman. There's not enough black weatherman. Or one person stands and goes, get off the stage, and then everyone else is like, yeah, get off the stage.
The rejection spread through the audience like a contagion. One person's disapproval became collective judgment, and within seconds, Wood Jr. found himself facing a wall of hostility that seemed impossible to overcome. The Apollo crowd's ability to unite in rejection was as legendary as their capacity for celebration.
You can see the boo coming, like you can see the wave. It's like a sonic wave, like a sound wave, like when a jet breaks the sound barrier, you see the wall of cloud. It's like, it's a sonic boom of rejection making its way towards you.
Wood Jr.'s description captured the unique trauma of Apollo failure in the television age. This wasn't just about bad material or poor timing. It was about experiencing collective judgment in its purest, most devastating form, all while cameras rolled for national broadcast. The aftermath was particularly difficult because it happened during the early days of internet culture. Videos and clips from televised performances could live forever online, meaning that one bad night could follow a comedian indefinitely. The modern Apollo band carried digital permanence that earlier generations never faced, but Wood Jr.'s experience was still part of a tradition that connected him to performers from different eras. Like the comedians who came before him, he had to learn that the Apollo demanded something special. Unlike them, his lesson was preserved forever in pixels and bandwidth. The final story in this collection shows how even established performers could misread the Apollo's unique demands. Where Roy Wood Jr. faced the Apollo as a relatively unknown comedian, Jamie Foxx arrived in 1994 as a rising star with everything to prove. He had already shown versatility as a musician, impressionist, and comedian, but the Apollo represented a unique challenge, a chance to prove his authenticity to the black audience that would ultimately determine his career trajectory. Foxx's decision to perform experimental material at the Apollo revealed both his artistic ambition and his fundamental misunderstanding of the venue's expectations. The Apollo audience came to see polished performances, not artistic experiments from performers still finding their voice. This was the mistake that would temporarily exile him from comedy's most important stage.
Think of all the things that we can do. Maybe we could try out something.
The musical performance that opened Foxx's set showed impressive vocal ability and stage presence, but it felt disconnected from the Apollo's comedy tradition. The audience seemed confused about whether they were watching a comedian or a singer, creating uncertainty that would plague the entire performance. Foxx's material became increasingly sexual and explicit, but without the sharp social commentary that typically accompanied such content at the Apollo. The performance felt more like a nightclub act than the sophisticated political humor the venue was known for. The crowd was polite but distant. The audience's lukewarm response wasn't exactly booing, but it wasn't the enthusiastic support that Apollo performers needed to succeed. The polite applause felt more like obligation than genuine appreciation, which was almost worse than outright rejection. At least, booing was honest. The criticism that followed labeled Foxx as a West Coast comedian who didn't understand East Coast sensibilities. This geographic distinction was code for deeper cultural differences about authenticity, street credibility, and comedic sophistication. The Apollo had spoken, and its judgment was clear. Foxx's Apollo experience taught him valuable lessons about audience expectations and artistic choices. He learned that experimentation required a foundation of proven material and established credibility. The theater's lukewarm reception motivated him to develop more focused, audience-tested material before attempting future high-stakes performances. The soft ban that followed wasn't announced officially, but industry insiders understood that Foxx needed to prove himself on other stages before returning to the Apollo. His willingness to learn from the experience and adapt his approach ultimately contributed to his later success in film and television. From Paul Mooney's political exile to Jamie Foxx's experimental failure, these 6 stories reveal the Apollo Theater's role as comedy's ultimate quality control mechanism. Each comedian learned that the Apollo wasn't just a venue. It was a judgment that could elevate careers or destroy them in real time. The bans weren't arbitrary punishments, but consequences of failing to meet the theater's uncompromising standards. Paul Mooney discovered that even legendary writers could be silenced when their truth-telling threatened corporate interests. Dave Chappelle's early humiliation became the foundation for fearless artistry. Mason Pryor learned that legacy opens doors but doesn't guarantee success. Tracy Morgan proved that persistence could overcome even devastating failure. Roy Wood Jr. experienced how modern technology made Apollo rejection permanent and inescapable. Jamie Foxx realized that experimentation required established credibility and audience trust. Each story connected to the others through the Apollo's unwavering demand for authenticity. The theater's willingness to reject even talented performers maintained its reputation as comedy's ultimate proving ground. In an industry increasingly dominated by focus groups and market research, the Apollo remained a place where authentic audience reaction determined success or failure. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.